Hi, welcome to this session on financial performance reporting. Important ratios to consider. Today, we'll be discussing some practical and time-efficient ways to take in a high-level measure of analysis for your credit union, as well as reviewing some key ratios that can help your level of understanding to ensure your credit union is moving in the right direction. When your credit union submits financial information to the NCUA, this information is used to create the Financial Performance Report, or FPR, which contains ratios over a period of time. In addition, the NCUA adds in your peer ratios to help gauge where you stand in a particular area. When reviewing these ratios over a given time frame, trends emerge that can be evaluated. Within the FPR report, there are many ratios, but today we'll highlight some of the more important ones, including net worth to total assets, delinquent loans to total loans, net charge-offs to average assets, return on average assets, yield on loans, cost of funds, net interest margin to average assets, and operating expense to average assets. Before we get started, if you've never seen an FPR before, here's a sample of the report layout. Notice how the historical information is on the left-hand side and the peer ratio is added to the right-hand side. Now that you've seen an example of the report, let's talk about what these ratios are and what they measure. The first ratio we are reviewing is the net worth to total assets ratio. This is a capital adequacy ratio that displays the credit union's worth in relation to the total assets. It is a key measurement indicating how much the credit union is worth and the primary measure of each credit union's financial strength. As you know, credit unions inherently have risk because we are in the business of buying and selling money. Depending on the market and the financial makeup of the credit union, losses can occur over a period of time. Net worth reserves for net losses should they occur and allows the needed capital to support growth. Most credit unions have a net worth ratio greater than 7%, which the NCUA deems well capitalized. A healthy indicator for credit unions would be a constant maintaining or growth in net worth. With the change in market interest rates, credit unions may experience margin compression, which directly impacts net worth. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. We'll discuss net interest margins later on in this video. The next important ratio is delinquent loans to total loans, which, as the name indicates, measures the credit union's delinquent loans in relation to the total loans. This is an indication of the institution's asset quality and can be an indicator of future loan losses. If the ratio is higher or is trending higher, it can indicate two things. First is the credit union's ability to control delinquency, and the second is the credit union's loan quality. Often during an extended period of low interest rates, this is a prevalent issue. Loan demand is low due to the low consumer confidence, uncertainty in employment, and the state of the economy, among others. To fill the need of loan growth, lower quality loans may be added to the balance sheet. While you will see a benefit in the loan yield, often a credit union will experience a higher delinquency rate due to the credit risk. This is an important one to watch as delinquencies typically increase during a rising rate environment. Like the delinquent loans to total loans ratio, the net charge-offs to average assets ratio is an asset quality ratio. This is a valuable ratio when evaluating the effectiveness of the lending and collection process. If this ratio is trending higher, it indicates that the credit union has been unable to collect on a delinquent loan and the loan has defaulted. The net amount, or loan balance less any repossession value, is reflected in this ratio. If the trend of this ratio has been climbing, lending policies on both credit quality and collection process should be reviewed to ensure an effective approach to the process. If this ratio is low, using the peer ratio as a gauge, then the credit union's lending practices are effective. Next up on our list is the loans to asset ratio. This ratio is a liquidity ratio. If it's high, this can potentially mean the credit union's liquidity is tight and the credit union has a high percentage of its assets lent out to its membership. Typically, in a rising rate environment, consumer loan demand increases and the loan-to-asset ratio rises, putting pressure on liquidity. On the other hand, during a falling rate environment, consumer confidence weakens, loan demand declines, and the credit union ends up with excess liquidity. In addition to liquidity, this is an important ratio as it drives earnings. Loans are the highest yield asset on the balance sheet. A larger ratio here translates to increased earnings potential. Now, let's talk about return on average assets. Return on average assets, also referred to as ROA, is an earnings ratio measurement which represents the net income in relation to average assets. ROA indicates the level of return generated through the buying and selling of funds throughout the year. If the credit union displays a positive ROA, then the income generated through the year was more than the cost of deposits, provision for loan loss, and operating expenses. The return on assets is important because it helps to sustain our capital levels. The opposite is also true. A negative ROA or a net loss will reduce capital. Let's switch gears to yield on loans and cost of funds. Yield on loans is an earning ratio that depicts the total yield on loans the credit union holds on its books. As you can see in the graph, loan yields trended up for the first 3 years and declined in years 4 and 5. As market interest rates rise and the credit union can originate loans at higher rates, yields improve. However, when market rates fall, loan offering rates follow suit, bringing down the total loan yield. Cost of funds is also an earnings ratio, but it shows the total cost to the credit union for deposits. Like loan yields, when market rates increase, the credit union increases their share rates, thereby increasing the cost of funds. When the market declines, the credit union reduces their share rates, thus reducing the cost of funds. This is a trend you can see on the graph. Unlike loan rates, changes to non-maturity shares are immediate. As soon as the credit union raises rates, it affects the entire balance. During the time period on the graph, it is easy to see an increase in loan yields and the cost of funds in years 1 through 3, and the steady decline of the yield on loans and the cost of funds in years 4 and 5. Within that time period, there was an increase in the market rates followed by a decline in market rates, which flows through to the loan rates credit unions were able to lend out and the deposit rates paid for funds. Now, we'll discuss net interest margin to average assets. The net interest margin is the difference between interest income earned on loans and investments and interest expense paid on shares and borrowings, expressed as a percentage of average assets. Net interest income is the credit union's primary source of income. The ratio measures how well the credit union is managing lending, investing, and funding strategies. Rates charged by the credit unions on loans and dividends paid on shares is the result of business decisions. Because we buy money from depositors and pay them an interest rate, and lend money to borrowers and charge them an interest rate, these decisions are largely based on current rate environment. When the market operates at a higher level, typically a wider spread exists between the short-term and long-term rates. The graph displays several actual historical U.S. Treasury yield curves since the Great Recession. In the rising cycle graph, rates steadily increase over a 3-year period. In year 4, quarter 2, the graph is upward sloping, which is considered a normal curve. When rates rise, the short end of the curve typically increases higher than the long end of the curve, which is shown in the year 4, quarter 4 graph. You can also see the impact rising rates have on the credit union's net interest margin. As market rates rose, the credit union's net interest margin also increased. Since credit unions buy funds, such as shared and certificate shares, they pay less for these funds based on the short end of the curve. In turn, the credit union takes those shares and lends them out at a higher rate in a longer-term consumer or mortgage loan based on the mid to longer rates on the curve. Any funds the credit union obtains and cannot lend are invested. The difference between the share rate and the loan or investment rate is called the spread. The higher the spread, the higher the net interest margin. In the declining cycle, rates declined between year 4 and year 6, with short-term rates declining more than long-term rates. In year 7, short-term rates remained constant, but longer-term rates started to move back up. As market rates declined, the net interest margin also declined. Not only were market rates low, but there was not a lot of difference between the 3-month rate and the 5-year rate. This resulted in a reduction in the spread between the cost of shares and the rate on loans and investments. The credit union's pricing of loans and shares and the spread between the two is a critical component of the net interest margin ratio and the credit union's ability to generate income. The last important ratio is the operating expense to average assets ratio, which is an earnings ratio. Operating expense includes all non-interest expenses of the credit union. It excludes the provision for loan loss and interest expense. This ratio is a measure of operating efficiency of the credit union. If this ratio is too high, it affects the profitability of the credit union. During times when net interest margins are tight, increased scrutiny is placed on tightening operating expenses because the margins are not high enough to cover operating expenses. Like all other ratios, this should be compared to the peer data in an effort to gauge the credit union's efficiency. Again, we are using a time period to capture the trend of the operating expenses as we did with the yield curve on loans and cost of funds. As shown on the graph, we are looking at a trend in operating expenses compared to the trend in the net interest margin. Operating expenses exceeds the net interest margin in all periods presented. The net interest margin has not exceeded operating expenses since the first year. As shown in the graph, operating expenses declined over years 1 through 6. As net interest margins began to rise over 3%, the operating expense also increased. However, when margins began to decline in year 9, credit unions were forced to start cutting back on operating expenses to help the bottom line, or the ROA. Now that we've covered key ratios, we want to leave you with some main takeaways. Be careful when comparing your credit union to the peer data. Often, it can be tempting to just want to have the best numbers, but it is important to consider the financial makeup of your credit union because each credit union is uniquely different. When reviewing trends, you must consider the current market rate environment. This will help you to understand why the trend is occurring. After you review the ratios, the next step is identifying if there are any areas that the credit union should strive to improve upon. So there you have it. By taking a look at and deepening your understanding of all of these key ratios in the ratio analysis report, you can ensure your credit union is moving in the right direction. Thank you for joining us.